Good evening, everybody. I'm coming at you Sunday evening. Today's lecture will be relatively short. As I said before in the email that I sent to you all, there's no video classrooms this week. Why? Because the readings are pretty straightforward. I'd rather have you watch, suggested, of course, just like the video classrooms are optional but suggested. The the additional resources that I emailed to you earlier today. So I think you get more out of that watching those excellent video clips than from a pretty straightforward discussion we might have, right? Because the readings are not that difficult relative to the other ones that we had had this week. In fact, of the philosophers, this week might be the easiest, if not it might be the easiest of the philosophical readings that you're going to have throughout the course. But don't short sight Mr. Bacon. So important is he in the development of Western thought and Western civilization that I included him among our select group of thinkers. Why is he so important? Because he was one of the first to, at least politically, publicly push the agenda of science, the new outlook of science. Now, whether he called it science or whether he called it knowledge, that's the term itself is not so important for us. But from our perspective, we would call him one of the founders of modern empirical thought. By empiricism, we mean those things that are empirically valid, empirically true. What do we mean by that? Observation, sensory perception. Knowledge comes through the senses, and you see this in other philosophers, especially in England, right? This is a very England is the mecca, if you will, of empiricism, modern empiricism. Very, very different from the idealism that we have studied so far. Idealism would say that if you sit in a room by yourself and you think clearly, think honestly, put aside your personal subjective context, even your self-interest at times, and think objectively, ideas of reality, the truth will come to you, whether it be of the good, beauty, justice, mathematics. These ideas are real. But in England especially, by the time we're talking about the 1600s, so it's quite a jump from the early classic thinkers we've been reading throughout the course. 1600s, and by this time, much of the idealism, especially Plato's idealism, has been rejected. And so most of society are on board with this new common sense, real world way of acquiring knowledge, furthering knowledge, and using knowledge in a particular way. We'll get into the use of knowledge a little bit later, but empiricism's main tenet is that knowledge comes through your senses, sensory perception. And whatever ideas we have are later reflections of the more immediate fundamental perceptions. And this is very reasonable from our perspective. You're not born with ideas, these innate forms that Plato and other idealists are talking about, but you're born tabula rasa, blank slate. Another philosopher around this time, John Locke, another British thinker, he made that famous tabula rasa. He believed that human nature, knowledge-wise, is blank. So the objective of a good society is to fill the minds with proper thoughts, proper sensations through education. So Francis Bacon is certainly within that camp. Knowledge comes through your senses, and he is the one who famously said that knowledge is power. Many of you are, maybe even use that term. You're very familiar with that. Knowledge is power. We say that kind of like in our public service announcements, reading Rainbow or whatever, if they still have those announcements. Knowledge is power. Like a lot of librarians say that to their patrons, the kids. You have to read because knowledge is power. Or political figures would say certain things like that to encourage people to vote. How do you vote? You have to learn about the issues. Knowledge is power. These sorts of things. Not exactly what Francis Bacon had in mind, but still somewhat similar. When he said knowledge is power in one of his famous books, The Advancement of Learning, you're reading from the Novum Organum, right? That's another one of his very famous works, but the message is pretty similar. When Bacon says knowledge is power, he means a specific type of knowledge that is befitting of modern society. Modern society that is quickly becoming less and less religious, meaning dogmatic. Now, although he was loyal to the church. I say that carefully because he's a very ambitious man, as Bertrand Russell points out, to his detriment in a way, ironically, because he's pushing science, 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 but his ambition is, this is Russell's view, that Bacon was so ambitious about his personal career, becoming an important man, furthering the progress of society, that he neglected many of the great scientific discoveries, knowledge discoveries during his time. He rejected the Copernican revolution, and his contemporary was Kepler, one of the major innovators of the Copernican idea that the Earth is not the center of the universe. It can't be, based on observation. So here's Bacon pushing his political agenda of we must, as Britain, as the West, we must master nature through our knowledge. But yet, and through observation, through testing, verification, a systematic discovery, right? A systematic program of discovery. He kind of missed out on the Copernican revolution, and among other things, right? There were a lot of discoveries during this time, so he himself might have been not so consistent with his own agenda, but that's not so important. He's pushing the agenda, and he was very successful in pushing his agenda politically. He was very politically connected, very ambitious. So if you like our modern society, our modern mindset in the way we understand the world, the way that we manipulate nature. Now that sounds harsh, but one of the best definitions of modernity that I have ever read is simply mastery of nature, man's mastery of nature. Now, if you're more kind of like, the cosmic type, the tree hugger sort of type, the spiritual type of person, you might not like that, because who are we, mere humans, to master nature? But it is the modern audacity to think that one can shape one's destiny by what? Learning of the patterns, the laws of nature, and using that knowledge to manipulate one's own future. One's own destiny is in one's own hand. It's humanism 101, right? Humanism puts the human being at the center of reality. So how is that possible? Through acquisition of knowledge, understanding the laws of nature, and using that knowledge to one's benefit, to the benefit of mankind, not nature. Again, this might not sit well with one of you. Maybe some of you are just thinking that Francis Bacon started this whole chain, which led to science, technology, which led to capitalism, which led to this commercial consumer society, this materialism in the broad sense, but especially in the particular sense we use materialism, kind of a consumer materialism. And so you might not like it, but think about what it would mean to live as one prior to this transformation of knowledge acquisition, transformation of knowledge itself, how we think about knowledge. If we were still living in the days when human beings would be subject to the fates, the gods, the universe, the laws of the universe dictate who we are, we would be quite submissive to the fates. We would realize that we're very insignificant, and we wouldn't dare to imagine other ways of life and to shape our way accordingly. We wouldn't do this. But with people like Francis Bacon, because of their contributions, they're pushing our way toward this audacious project. It's a really grand project if you think about this. That through our knowledge of nature, we could imagine better ways of life. We could imagine more comfortable ways of life. We could imagine better ways of living. More efficient ways of living. That word, efficiency, right? So, not only effective, but efficient. A way to manage nature itself. For whose advantage? Not for the good necessarily, like the form of the good, as Plato might say, but, or for even God's glory. Before this time, many people might have thought, no, for the pleasure of man, for utility, human utility. So think about what we do to nature. Ladies, not only ladies, but especially ladies in our culture, you get married, you are expected, I mean, if you're lucky, to get a very big diamond on your ring. Well, where does that diamond come from? Certainly it's not some natural desire, right? People throughout history weren't born to say, oh, I must get a big shiny rock on my finger. No. It's a manufactured desire. It's a manufactured process. The diamond itself is manufactured. We literally have to dig with great effort and danger often to dig up these rocks from deep down in the earth. And then we take them out, we refine them, we craft them, we put it on a kind of a gold band, and where we get gold as well, same process. And then we sell it, we market it. The foods that we eat, most of it is genetically modified by this time. And even if not, we had to develop ways of unnaturally producing so much, and so predictably, and so expertly and efficiently. Technologies of agriculture, irrigation, knowledge of horticulture, all of these things, right? Weather predictions, all of these things from the Baconian method, right? Bacon's method of scientific research, his agenda of knowledge acquisition. So the things that we take for granted all the time, computers, iPads, the internet, clothes, glasses, anything you could imagine now, you have to thank people like Francis Bacon, because without this sort of agenda being pushed forward so aggressively in early modernity, we would be nowhere near the comforts that we have, the efficiencies that we have, economies of scale that we have. For those of you who know a bit about economics, these are just everyday things in our lives. So, although at once when you hear knowledge is power, and when you realize that what he's saying is that it gives humanity power over nature, at first glance you might have a negative view of that. Yet, if you appreciate modern philosophy, and we're going to shift toward modern philosophy probably from this point forward, if you appreciate modern thought and modern life, the modern outlook, then one thing you have to get over is the fact of life, our life now, that we have mastered nature. There's no way around this. There's no way around it. Um, Morally speaking, when we talk about more moral philosophers later on, um, the assumption is still the same there as well in that domain. Nature is not enough for human beings. To live naturally is not enough for human beings. So we have to rationally come up with ethical systems, how to live well, how to live ethically. These are rational constructs, no longer natural. Um, Economy, our whole economic system, systems of trade are no longer natural economies. Natural economies is barter system, but there's no order to such an economy like that. There's some, radical economists slash philosophers now who are calling for gift, some sort of a return to a gift economy when we're not abstracting value in terms of money, finances, labor power to finances, to abstract money. But would we really want to live in a time like this where you can't go to a market or you can't go online shopping? Certainly you can't go to a bank and draw money out, but your literal power to purchase things is what you could give and take, barter, right? How would you go about doing it? You need butter to bake some bread, right? Or put on your bread at home. So what you don't have a cow, you're not gonna churn butter. You know how to do this, right? So what are you gonna do to a person who happens to have a cow and churns delicious butter? You have to offer some service. Maybe I'll farm for you for that day, manual labor that day. Maybe I'll lecture on philosophy to you that day. Probably not, but you have. It's so inconvenient is the point. The inconveniences of a pre-modern way of life. Although romantically we might say, oh, that's a better way of doing it, right? It's too inconvenient for the vast majority of us. So, some critics say that we have done violence to nature. Some people who kind of use it figuratively, or even a few who believe literally that there is a Mother Earth, right? That we do violence to her when we mine for minerals, right? Or carbon fuels, things like this. Yes, there's some drawbacks to our way of life, certainly now. But how many of us would want to go to the inconveniences, the inconsistency, the lack of order, the lack of manageability of a pre-modern way of life? So if you like our life right now and can't imagine living outside of our own life, then a person like Francis Bacon becomes very respectable. Despite his personal inconsistencies and hypocrisies and probably overambition and all of this. But as Russell says on page 543, Bacon was one of the first of the long line of scientifically minded philosophers, emphasizing the importance of induction as opposed to deduction. This is basically another way of saying what I said. The idealists, people like Plato, and to a large extent Aristotle, although Aristotle and Plato differ considerably, but their relative difference is not that big of a difference to a person like Bacon by the time the 1600s, because Bacon targets Aristotle quite a bit, right? That we have to let go of this kind of outmoded way of thought because Aristotle was one of the great logicians of any era, right? So Aristotle does science wrong, is what Bacon is saying, that we need to have a new way of acquiring knowledge, that Aristotle was not scientific enough is what he's implying here. Although Aristotle was like the great scientist of his day, but so much has changed till now. By induction, we're meaning the empirical method, the scientific method. You observe, right? You observe, you collect data, And then from this data, you'll see patterns emerging from which we can then hypothesize. The word hypothesis you're familiar with, right? We have an idea of how a problem is to be solved. So this agenda is clearly a problem-oriented outlook. You wouldn't have modern science without any problems. And by what problems we're talking about? Oh, I don't know. I want a more efficient way of not starving, eating. So farming, better ways of fishing, better ways of hunting. Fertilizer, making crop yields more productive. Addressing these problems. So then we have these technologies, these advancements of ideas on how to solve this problem. But each one of these attempts at solving the problem are hypotheses at that time. I will hypothesize that I will collect cow dung and even human dung and put it near the crops, on the crops even, the seeds. And then lo and behold, my hypothesis is correct, that fertilizer yields a better crop. Maybe people thought it was crazy at that time, or very much so, like in much of history, scientific history, maybe it was just discovered by accident. There's a place over there we all take a dump or something, right? Or we throw our cow dung over there, but then how come that area, the crops grow better? Penicillin, great example, accidental discovery, right? So what Russell hints at, he should even press even further, that the notion, this is on page 554, toward the bottom, Russell. Bacon is too neat and clean with his notion of the scientific method, that you just collect data and then the proper hypothesis, the idea based on the observation of that data will emerge, and then the problem will soon be solved. It's not always that easy. That's the perfect scenario, and it sometimes happens, of course, but hypothesizing is actually almost an artistic endeavor. You have to have some sort of intuition, and you can't count on intuition sometimes. So a mathematician is a bad example, because math is more deductive thinking, where you don't have to collect data, you just think a lot, right? Think. The laws of logic, you begin with a solid principle and then you build up, right? That's not induction. Induction is messy. It's the real world. Certainty is not the assumption nor the goal, but probability is. Practical yield, fruitfulness. These are words that shape up what becomes a scientific method. Deductive method is not necessarily about fruitfulness or probability, but is certainty. Logic would not work if it was just probable, because probable implies that once in a while it is not the case. You can't have that. Logic and mathematics have to be foolproof. So the inductive method is the empirical method. Observation, hopefully patterns will emerge, and hopefully an intuition will come up of a hypothesis to address the problem, and then the scientific method really kicks in. Once you have a hypothesis, then you could test it again, and if these become verified, replicated, the experiments are replicated, and then the hypothesis is verified again and again, it soon becomes laws, scientific laws, right? You're familiar with this. This is the modern scientific method, and a person like Bacon is one of the people at the forefront of building this new outlook, this new mode of attack on how to solve problems, how to address uncertainty in a world that is no longer unknowable. The world, the universe is no longer unknowable. It's daunting in the sense, of course, that there's so much we don't know, but yet it's not unknowable. It's a his assumption. So through much effort, collectively, we can build knowledge a bit at a time, collectively. Inductive method. So, I read an article about a couple years ago, where Sergey something, I forget his last name, but one of the founders of Google, one of the founders and CEOs of Google, he has a condition. I'm not sure what it. I think it might be Alzheimer's, if I remember. Yeah, ironically, I forgot about that, right? But I think it is Alzheimer's. I think he has an early case diagnosis of that, right? No, I'm sorry. It's Parkinson's, I believe, is what he has. So he knows he has Parkinson's, but one of his great projects. Now, I don't think it's just self-interested. He really wants to help other people like him as well. This guy has, he's one of the handful of people in the world that can dedicate so much time, manpower, and just money to this problem. So he invested much of his great fortune to this huge project of somehow solving Parkinson's. Well, then you clearly have a problem. But how are you going to go about solving Parkinson's, right? But Google is better than anyone in the world at collecting data, obviously. So his assumption is very much like Bacon's. You collect enough data on a certain problem, anything related to that problem, and then patterns will emerge, and then hypotheses will pop up, and you test these hypotheses one by one, and hopefully the problem will be addressed. So you don't have to depend on dumb luck or intuition, but you could almost direct yourself toward knowledge, new knowledge. Direct yourself toward discovery. Think how radical that is. Throughout most of human civilization, knowledge, new knowledge, really helpful, radical new knowledge was from the gods, the gift of the gods, divine inspiration. We still say, or even if you're not religious, it's like the fates, nature has given this, sheer accident. But Francis Bacon, Mr. Sergey at Google, many other people now believe that we can direct ourselves toward the answer. We'll fumble around, but it's not an irrational, random fumbling around. It's a directed, systematic, efficient way of fumbling around toward that general area, and then hopefully the problem will be solved. And a lot of computer programmers now are building algorithms for precisely this. The Google method, as I mentioned before, is all algorithmic. You collect all this data, and then algorithms, computer programs, will be able to mine data. Some of you are familiar with this. The techies in the crowd. Data mining, right? Just like we go into the earth and mine diamonds and things like this, these algorithms, far better, faster than human beings could ever do, they're able to see patterns emerge from this chaotic, what seems to be chaotic, mass of data. And then information will emerge from data. Data is just this raw potential knowledge, let's say. And from there, orderly information, useful information will emerge. We'll see. Good luck to Sergey. Hopefully he will, help cure Parkinson's. We all hope this. No one knows, of course, but we all hope this. And he's probably approaching it in the most reasonable way that we have, right? That we know of doing. So it's not perfect, but the inductive method is perhaps, probably in our day, the most reasonable way of approaching the problem, the big fundamental problem of uncertainty. How does rational man live and survive and live well in an uncertain world, in an uncertain universe. The most reasonable approach is induction. So at the first steps, it seems almost random. You're blindly walking out there into the unknown. But quickly you collect data, and then patterns will emerge, and you could then be able to even master, at least manage what was before the great unknown. Think of weathermen, weather persons, meteorology, that science. When it first started, it was just obviously horrible. Oh, it looks cloudy. It might rain. I don't know. But now, the accuracy of meteorological forecasting is just absolutely incredible. It's incredible. Never before has been as accurate, of course. And this is, characteristic of inductive research. The more data you have, the more experience, the more tests and verification, the more collective knowledge you have, the more and more accurate it becomes. Never perfect, but more and more probable. So probable that the goal is that the difference between such a high rate of probability and absolute certainty becomes relatively insignificant, practically insignificant to us. And weather forecasting is one of those fields. Now, one of the shortcomings of the inductive method is pointed out by the great skeptic David Hume. We will talk about Hume in this course as well. But David Hume famously attacks induction by saying something that seems so unreasonable, but what he is saying is actually true. He's reminding us of the ever-present shortcoming, the weakness, if you will, the imperfection of inductive knowledge. He says, I wake up every morning, and every morning the sun rises with me. Just because, though, every morning the sun rose with me, I cannot say for certain that the sun will rise tomorrow. Well, you might say, well, that's probably more certain than you waking up tomorrow, Hume, right? But what is his point? It is true. It's true. There's a limit to predictive power, is what he is saying. A lot of people get confused. Let's say you have a coin. You think it's magical. You flipped it 1,000 times, and each time it's a tail. Tail, not heads, 1,000 times in a row. And you tested it and everything, and you realize it's a fair coin. It's not one of those magician coins or whatever. So, would you bet your life that on the 1,001st time that you flip it, that it will be tails again? You'd be foolish to do so. Because every instance, every event is a new instance. There is no certainty. There is no certainty of prediction based on inductive experience. That's the point that Hume was making. Sure, there's a great likelihood it will be, but no, is what Hume says. Deduction is very different. 2 plus 2 is always 4. Logical fallacy is always a logical fallacy. And logic and mathematics have to operate that way. So, if you could understand, if you can describe and even give an example perhaps of the difference between deductive method and inductive method, you've gone very far in understanding Bacon's contribution to modern society as well. One of the in the readings you'll find out, but when he talks about these idols, don't take it literally, right? It's more provocative was his program. He has a way with words. Don't take it literally. These idols are real, but it is interesting. He says that these idols of knowledge are what we have to watch out for, because he's attacking dogma and custom and bad thinking generally that leads a lot of people away from true knowledge. These idols of the mind, idols of thought, idols of knowledge, these false idols of knowledge is what he's saying. These are things that we should be wary of and not led astray by. Now, as far as his own life is concerned, he was quite very successful actually, right? And so um, you can read him in a disfavorable way, unfavorable way by saying that maybe more than his interest in the scientific method, more than his interest in the pursuit of knowledge, uh, he is more interested in his personal life. That's kind of how Russell spins it. But that might not be fair to him. I mean, you can be both, right? You can be very ambitious, but yet do great things with your ambition. Or maybe your ambition is um, is indicative. Your personal ambition is indicative of your ambition to actually do something greater than just your own life. Perhaps that's probably how I would read it, a little bit more charitably, but try to uh, appreciate how important a person like Francis Bacon is. Especially, I would say, for those of you who are in any profession will go into any profession that handles information, IT, information technology, library science, another very popular major, right? Um, just anything that has to, even like if you're going to business, finance, you have to deal with tons of experience. By experience, we mean information, right? Because what is financial data? It's information of things in the past. You're trying to use the projection into the future. Um, the actuarial sciences, insurance, the insurance business is what I'm talking about, right? That's all inductive method. Many of you are going to go into statistics, fields that use and deal with statistics, induction, statistics, probability. This is all induction. So, so especially for those students who are going into those fields, you have to really appreciate what Bacon has done for you. I have a friend who's, I hadn't seen him in a while, but then I knew that he went he quit his job. He was in sales, I believe. He quit his job. Um, then he went to college, went to school for like a second degree, for a few years. And then I bumped into him, and then he gave me a business card, real fancy business card. And his title is information architect. So I asked him, what the heck is this? What is information architect, right? Then he went on a whole long spiel. He's very passionate about it, which I admire passionate people, expert at what he does now. He's doing very well. And so he was saying that information architect is, one of the titles in this big field that many people might not even be aware of that exists. But it might actually be perhaps the most important field in our time today, knowledge management. Every huge corporation, every university, Shenandoah as well, has their own, the terms might be different, but knowledge management department. And usually, where is this knowledge stored? These big servers up in the cloud, either on campus or somewhere else. I mean, if they're good, they're using, best practices for safety and stuff, they have to have redundant locations, right? On site and then somewhere out there. This is knowledge management. Think about it. Can our world exist without some sort of systematic, orderly way of handling, managing, collecting, analyzing, and making use of all this knowledge? Massive overload, information overload for you and I. Personally, we could never process this sort of stuff. But these fancy algorithms written by very bright people are managing all this stuff for us. So we wouldn't have these fields, is what I'm saying. We wouldn't have this new way of life. You are not just you, but you are all the trails, the experience of data throughout your whole life that you've generated, that is somehow compiled somewhere up in the clouds. And I mean, we hope it's used for the good, right? There's some sort of conspiracy theories, things like that, or privacy issues even. What is Facebook doing with my information, you might ask? Who knows, right? Who knows? Might not be the most innocent purposes, but we wouldn't have these problems. We wouldn't have these possibilities. We wouldn't have this new worldview. We wouldn't have these fields called knowledge management or these people called information architects. We wouldn't have this. We wouldn't have data mining. We wouldn't have financial projections. We wouldn't have weather forecasting. We wouldn't have poker charts, poker strategies, right? It's all probability. Without a person like Francis Bacon or people like him who have aggressively moved us from the medieval, pre-modern way of subjecting ourselves to nature, to the will of the gods, to mastery over the universe. We are the masters of the universe. Why? Because we now know the laws of the universe and we can manipulate them to our own advantage. Knowledge is truly power. Knowledge is truly power. With that, I will leave you to your reading so you can acquire more knowledge and be more powerful, at least for the purposes of this class, getting a good grade. I'm more interested not necessarily in your grades, but in reading your reflections on this. What do you think Bacon's contribution to modern life and modern science is and continues to be? Is it for the good? Did it make the world and our lives worse? You could add those thoughts as well. So I look forward to your reflections, and I'm very much enjoying a lot of your work. A lot more recently than in the first kind of couple weeks. They were a little bumpy, right? Because the material is tough. But I've really been enjoying your work. I see a lot of improvement in almost all of you, actually, your work. I get the sense that you're less intimidated by the material by now. And philosophy, if not fun, I hope it's fun for you as well. But philosophy is at least very interesting, and it is meaningful perhaps in many of your lives, right? That's what I hope. That's my great hope in this course. So continue reading. I think you'll maybe not enjoy Bacon, but you should see a lot of familiar things about how we live and how we think about the world, how we process knowledge and process information and produce knowledge. You'll see a lot of familiarities between how we think about the world in Bacon's original work and also Russell's analysis of Bacon. So I'll sign off for now. Have a good week, and we won't have those virtual classrooms for this week again. But please do email me. Some of you are writing me a lot of good questions via email. So I will look forward to reading your assignment and your emails as well. Take care.